So my name is Leanne Pitas-Musak Simpson. I've been doing land-based education for about 20 years. I am faculty at the Dechinta Center for Research and Learning. I live in Peterborough, Ontario. I'm Michi-Sagi Anishinaabe from Alderville First Nation. And I'm really excited for this conversation. Who would like to go next? Max, you're next in my speaker view.
All right, I'm next then. Tanche, Max Libaran de Chinekashun, Laklabish dus Chien, Ikiamiti Nation. My name is Max Libaran. I am Métis. I'm scooped, so I'm connecting and reconnecting, although I grew up on our traditional territory, luckily. I'm from Laklabish, Treaty 6, Northern Alberta, but I now live and work on Beothuk lands in Newfoundland and Labrador, in St. John's, and I run a feminist and anti-colonial marine science laboratory called CLEAR. And so, yeah, I'm going to be talking about all the compromises and impurities that come with that kind of position.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. Riley?
Bonjour, my name is Riley Kucherin. I'm a Ojibwe and Ukrainian from Pick River First Nation, which is where I currently am. I am a PhD student and an incoming assistant professor of design leadership at Ryerson University School of Fashion. So I work on Indigenous fashion, its history and significance, and the theory of Indigenous fashion, which also happens to be very queer. And I have spent some time up at Dechinta, first as a student and then as an assistant. Yeah, excited to be here.
Awesome, thanks. Ryan?
Did you call me? I'm sorry, it bleeped
Sorry,
out.
I might have unmuted myself in the middle. Yeah, Ryan.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm really excited for today's panel, and I just feel really immensely honored to be sharing space with such an amazing group of people. I had a chance to take a quick look at everyone, what they're doing, and it just looks so amazing. So it's really encouraging to see all this kind of amazing work that everyone's doing. Oki niksokwa idamix ganata ni stuanagok sikabyoch kitopi ni tu gana nut katsitsins ixganag kitsitsmatsimp hua anuch tsistigoy. So my Blackfoot name is Sikabyoch Kitopi, but I also go by Ryan. I'm Siksikaitstipi from Ghana. I live in Sikokatoki, the city of Lethbridge, in the heart of Blackfoot territory, and I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia on unceded Musqueam territory, and a lot of my research is kind of built on my interests in queer Blackfoot traditions, queer Blackfoot life and politics, and trying to think through the kind of complications with trying to engage in these kinds of conversations when there's such highly divisive questions of memory in the context and aftermaths of targeted gender oppression and violence. And so trying to think through how do we have these kinds of conversations when anti-queer violence and heteropatriarchy are still very much kind of visible, not only in kind of settler contexts, but also within our own communities. And so that's kind of where my work is coming from. Yeah.
Thank you. Maddie?
Morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay. Good. Okay. It's I'm wearing my noise blocking headphones, so I can't hear me. That's why I was weird. So introduce myself. So yeah, my name is Maddie Wheatung. I am Anishinaabe, Michi-Sagi Anishinaabe from Curve Lake First Nation. I also live in Peterborough, Nagojoanong. And I am a PhD student at UBC in the geography department. And I will also be joining Riley at Ryerson as a new faculty member in geography. Starting next week, can't believe it. So my research is about accountability in the queer community, and particularly with attention to our geographies and our places and the way that we take into account Indigenous land in those processes. So because I'm Mississauga and because I'm living in this territory, I base my work here, and right now my work is happening with people who are living or connected to the territory in some way, and I'm just in the very exciting research interview phase. So now that it's summer and I can sit outside with people and do physically distant interviews, the work can go on. So, Miigwech, I'm very excited to be here and chat with all of you on this group.
Miigwech. Kyle, can you introduce yourself? I noticed you're back.
Yeah, I'm back. So that thing is happening, but that's okay. I think I sorted out something new this time. So yeah, Masi. My name is Kyle Shaughnessy, and I'm talking to you today from Stalo and Tsleil-Waututh territory in Vancouver, BC, at my home. So I am mixed background. So I am both Irish on one side of my family and sort of mixed European and Dene on the other side of my family. So my family is from Yellowknife. It's where I was born and spent the first few years of my life. And it's where a lot of my family still lives. And so they are Clicho First Nation. And yeah, and I'm also Two-Spirit identified, so transgender Two-Spirit identified person. And so my roles in terms of what I do for work, I'm an Indigenous education consultant at the Center for Teaching and Learning Technology at UBC, and then also in a split role with the HR department in terms of like staff training. So a lot of the work that I'm doing revolves around land acknowledgement, and specifically since we've sort of shifted to this online learning, doing land acknowledgements is something that a lot of folks are really wanting to brush up on, get more comfortable with right now, because it's really changed the landscape of that, because we're all in different territories. And so lots of people wanting to be able to speak to that well. And then my other sort of role is also as a grad student at Dalhousie University, sort of via distance. And so what I've been focusing on there for the last couple of years in my thesis is around the healing roles of Two-Spirit educators. So just interviewing Two-Spirit educator folks, so folks who do like diversity training, Two-Spirit training, Two-Spirit teaching, and talking to them about how they see themselves as having a role in their community, and also borrowing on so much of Alex's work. I'm very excited to be in your company. Just around if they see that education experience and coming into an educator role as something that assisted them in coming in as a Two-Spirit person as well. So borrowing on a lot of amazing work, and so excited to be in the company of so many amazing people today. So Masi.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you, Alex.
Great! Wow, what a lineup! It's an honor to be on this with you. And my name is Alex Wilson. I'm from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation and in Treaty 5 territory. Right now I'm at my parents' place and my mom just walked in. She's been taking part in these webinars in the background. Last time I was in the truck and she was sitting there with me. But yeah, so this is where I grew up, and if I can turn the thing around here, maybe you can see the creek at the back there. And so that creek is called Pamaskatapan, which means a bit off to the side. And it was where people would pull over off the main river system here. So we're on the Saskatchewan River Delta, and the Saskatchewan connects to Lake Winnipeg, and then north as well to a number of lakes, and then all the way to the Hudson Bay. So this is where I grew up and lived my queer little life for the most part. And now I live back here about 20 miles north of here in our territory, Clearwater Lake, or Tigameg. So I'm a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, and we have a master's in Indigenous land-based education. This is the 10th year it's been running. And over the years, kind of learning that there's quite a variation on what people think of when they say land-based education. And then just learning from students and other community members about some of the issues that have come up as we continue to kind of contextualize and refine what we mean when we say land-based education, that this issue of queering has come up. And so there's a course that I teach called Queering Indigenous Land-Based Education, and I have to teach it this summer. And as you all know, COVID has impacted us. So now I'm trying to figure out how to queer the queering course without just making it all online. So we've been having discussions with Leanne and Glenn and Kelsey, and thought it'd be a good idea to have a webinar on this topic. Not just, obviously not just to help me with my course, but also because there's a need to create safe spaces and also think more critically about, what queering means and how it can be kind of transformative and liberatory for people. And I really love, Kalani Young is a Kanaka Maoli Hawaiian scholar, and she says queering is transforming poison into medicine. And I really like that kind of way of thinking about it. So queer can be a noun, of course, like when we're talking about people, but it's also a verb. And so that's kind of the way that I think about it. So we're really interested to hear from all of you as panelists. What does queering Indigenous land-based education mean to you? And does anyone want to volunteer to go first, or would you rather I kind of chose people? No one's going to say.
I want you to choose people, because that means at some point you'll choose me, and that will feel good.
Okay, I choose you then to start, Max.
Oh, that feels a little bit good, but not okay. All right. So we're doing question 1. What does queering Indigenous land?
Yeah.
Okay. So actually, Alex, you stole some of my thunder, which is fine. You can share. That's okay. It's good. Where queering is, sometimes it's a noun, like people use it, but I very much understand it as a doing and a being and a knowing. Like, it's not like, oh, that's queer, that stable thing that is done. Hooray, we have achieved queer right there. So it's doing things queerishly or queerly or that sort of stuff. And for me, that includes a lot of not reproducing or investing in binaries, not just straight or gay, male or female, but also things like alive or not alive, nature, culture, contaminated, pure. That's actually the worst one. Yeah, so that's really crucial. And it's actually really hard to do. I think Ryan was talking about how there's still a lot of this that still gets into even what we would call traditional culture and knowledge. For me, that also means some promiscuity around what counts as land-based education. And I do it in contaminated spaces in 2 senses. So I really love this quote you've introduced, that queering is turning poison into medicine. I feel like that is the best bumper sticker for my lab now. Because we do contamination in 2 senses. Number 1, almost all of my land-based work is literally organized around pollution, mostly plastic pollution, but plastics also have PCBs and all these other sort of nasty friends. But secondly, it's usually alongside or within Western science, which is not so queer and is really, and not fabulous almost at all, and really invested in these binaries that aren't queer and aren't good, and really believes in mastery, which is not very queer. So luckily science needs a lot of queering, and land education could use some queering, so they're pretty happy bedfellows in that way. But yeah, that's sort of the shortness of what queering and land-based education kind of looks like for me. This sort of turning poison into medicine and resisting and enacting things that are not binaries in this highly compromised space of science. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Maddie, do you want to add to that?
Sure, yeah. Thank you for that, Max. That was, yeah, really getting my brain going there. I think for me, I like what you said, Max, about not working in binaries and sort of not getting to this fixed location of like the perfect purity, because I think a lot of the work that I have done in terms of queering in land-based education has been about creating safe spaces for queer youth, really, because when I was a young queer person, a lot of the traditional land-based learning spaces didn't feel safe. And so for me, creating that safety has never been about, you know, there are like, you know, some, I mean, I'm gonna digress here a little bit, but I think like creating safe space for me has been about keeping as many people as possible in the circle. So I think sometimes within queer circles, we can think about safe space as sort of like removing people who we view as harmful. But when we are out on the land, especially being a part of communities, you know, where we sometimes come from trauma, we want to keep as many people in the circle as possible. And so for me, I think bringing in queer youth in ways that also bring in safe elders who are open to learning about queerness and sort of having that multi-generational, cross-generation learning about where everyone's at has been where some of the most exciting queering has happened. Yeah, maybe that's all I'll say for now.
Yeah, yeah, I'm interested to hear like what some of the things that you've done. Maybe you could just add to that. Sorry, I'm kind of going off the script, but I'm just getting excited here.
That's okay. Yeah. Well, I guess so. Some of it was what during my time at Dechinta as the land-based team leader, doing practicing like circle governance with the students and having queer students on site, and you know, working with student expectations about, you know, how like some of the olders or elders might not have the same knowledge or language or terminology, but you know, sort of, I guess, coaching the students on how to meet the olders and elders where they're at, and coaching the olders and elders on how to meet the students where they're at. And kind of a lot of my role, I suppose, when I've been on site at Dechinta has been kind of working in that in-between space. And then one of the things that we have done here in our own territory was organizing a canoe build, which was my hope, having been a part of some projects before that had not felt like safe learning spaces, was to, me and my co-organizer, an artist, local artist here, who is also an Anishinaabe, we sort of viewed ourselves as like, you know, we had been through some experiences, and we knew that maybe our traditional teachers, you know, the ones who held the traditional knowledge, might not have the same knowledge about gender or queerness that our queer youth were coming with, but we also wanted to be able to learn, you know, about canoe building. And so we sort of viewed it as, me and Tia just kind of like body blocking all the bad stuff that could have come out of that. And like we viewed ourselves as being in between some of that, the hurtful or harmful things that could have filtered down, and you know, being that person who says, well, I want to learn how to sew the canoe, and getting your hands on it, and then immediately handing it off to another young person who might not have been able to felt comfortable or safe asking to be in there. And then, then there was a lot of behind the scenes work, sort of like explaining to our teachers, this is how we think about gender, and this is how these are the kinds of things that maybe we cannot talk about while we're talking about the canoe. And so a lot of and this is, I suppose, it really links to my PhD research about accountability and how we try and keep people talking to each other, and just really meeting people where they're at with what they know, and not expecting everyone to have had the same level of exposure to everything all the time, I think. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thanks for that. Ryan, do you want to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of what has been said so far. It's really gotten me kind of thinking about kind of some of the challenges I've faced in my own kind of lived experience in my own community. But I also think part of this, like, queering land-based education is about recognizing the ways in which our practices are already queer. Part of the problem, I think, is that our ability to notice queerness has been weakened because we've been told that it's unnatural, it's sinful. We've kind of been conditioned to think in these binaries, not just in terms of gender, but also in terms of things like traditional modernity, the kind of urban life, city life. It's all of these things are in binaries, and we really have kind of been thrust into this kind of way of thinking by being in this relationship with settler colonialism, and what comes with that is cognitive imperialism. And I myself struggle because I've been conditioned to think this way, right? And so it's a constant process of trying to unlearn. And I think for a lot of queer Indigenous folks, we've been forced to kind of hide and learn to live in the peripheries of Indigenous life and politics. And so thinking about it more collectively or broadly, all Indigenous peoples, our way of life has been threatened by settler encroachment, by violence. And many of us have gone through great lengths to kind of defend ourselves and our lands from further violence. But I also think it is also in those moments of defending and resisting that this kind of politics of traditionalism can become toxic, and it can manifest into the anti-queer practices that exist in so many of our communities today. And so for me, I like that, what you said, Alex, it's about transforming kind of poison into medicine. And in my own MA thesis, the title of it was working with this theme of the need to smudging systems with a C. And it's about this kind of rejection of broad sweeping and repressive generalizations of traditional protocols that are exclusionary. They're activated within a particular kind of narrow view of traditionalism that is dangerous when land-based activities are kind of motivated by fear-driven logics that are kind of wrapped up in this desire to always preserve this authentic way of doing things. And I think that it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with wanting to kind of preserve or restore. I think that it's the way in which we go about doing it, just like how we're engaging in this kind of online way of learning. It's not inherently problematic, but we have to understand the context in which it's kind of situated in that it can become problematic. And so it's this fear, I think, of losing our way of life that prevents us from seeing and hearing and feeling the experiences of so many other diverse lived experiences happening outside of the category of authentic indigeneity. We don't recognize those as being this kind of expression of relational politics or ethics, but it's happening. It hasn't gone anywhere. I think for the most part, in many instances, I see a lot of Indigenous projects kind of framed as preservation or restoration, which are all kind of too frequently bundled with toxic nationalism, ableism, heteropatriarchy, and anthropocentrism. Many of us who I think are doing Indigenous land-based education that are receiving funding are also forced to adhere to this kind of neoliberal evidence-based funding model that kind of strips away what queerness is actually really about, which is the ability to imagine otherwise. It's kind of this rejection of being categorized and controlled, but a lot of the time we're kind of forced to adhere to different kinds of accreditation standards, best practices, which are all like too conveniently predicated on like Western colonial notions of success and what education is. And so by being part of that kind of a system, it's also kept us from, like, it's kept us on this fast-paced rhythm, where I think right now with what's happening with COVID, we've been able to kind of slow down and start to notice a lot of things that we haven't been before. Like when we're involved in a lot of these, whether it's university, when you're getting a degree or you're getting grant funding, a lot of us are kind of trapped or placed in a position where we're kept in this fast-paced rhythm with having to meet so many different deadlines, having to submit budgets, having to justify our budgets within this kind of funding model. And all of this really like prevents us from being able to actually be engaged in relational ways of being, to really critically reflect, to practice the art of noticing, to learn land literacy, and to actually like engage in relational thinking. And so I also see this as a problem with the toxic politics of traditionalism and these fear-driven logics that kind of attempt to harden Indigenous lifeways into rigid, narrow conceptualizations that are kind of built on gendered protocols and heteronormative thinking and being, that's kind of packaged and organized in a way that's intelligible for funders. And so for me, queering land-based education should be about trying to find ways we can work with the situations we're in and kind of making them our own and making the best of those situations. Many of us have had to do this in our own lived experience. So queering land-based education is kind of being open to experimenting with new ideas and techniques that allow us to think differently and be different. And I think that that's something that a lot of queer folks, indigiqueer or two-spirit, have really had to learn in many cases when we've been forced out of our communities due to violence. We've kind of been able to engage in these different ways of being in relation to our indigeneity that may not always fall into those romanticized or kind of stereotypical conceptions of what it means to be Indigenous or how to engage in land-based learning. And so I appreciated what Max said earlier, is like we also have to like think about what constitutes queer land-based activities. I think too often it gets framed in these dominant masculinist orientations. So we really need to kind of think critically about those particular contexts. Yeah.
Thank you. Kyle.
I knew I was next. I could feel I was next. It's like, oh, you take a sip of water, you're gonna look ready. Yeah, so what queering Indigenous land-based education means to me, I mean, I think so much of that is just being fully present and alive and acknowledged as a two-spirit person in the work that I'm doing. So the majority of the work that I'm doing right now is not tangibly land-based, it's about land. So it's talking about territory, it's talking about knowledge about land, it's talking about relationships with land. And so for me, I'm consistently and regularly modeling land acknowledgements or encouraging other folks along their path to be able to offer them in a way that feels good for them. And so for me, just consistently naming myself as a two-spirit person, naming any opportunities that I have to apply that lens, that two-spirit lens, those two-spirit teachings, any stories that relate back to gender and sexual diversity that I can weave into the ways that I'm educating is incredibly important to me, just to take up that space and that role. And I think that that is sort of the place that I've kind of come into, is realizing that this is what I do. This is what I love to do. This is where my heart is in having relational, is in offering relational education and being able to just sit with people in a learning process, develop those relationships. And that is sort of what my role is. That's sort of where I've come into as a two-spirit person. And so I think even just being able to mention, like when we're doing land acknowledgements, we speak a lot about, which nation, which peoples this land was traditionally inhabited by. But also when we talk about two-spirit people, we're a nation-based. When we're talking about land acknowledgements, that's nation-based, but when we're talking about two-spirit people, it's not necessarily nation-based. I mean, as much as we are, Indigenous first as an identity as two-spirit people, two-spirit people don't all come from the same geographic area, yet at the same time, there's high migration rates to be able to access communities and services and safety. So that needs to be acknowledged when we're acknowledging, when we're sort of queering that land-based education, or even talking about just ways to critically think about how we do our land acknowledgements. So something that I'm trying to mention is that when we engage in online spaces, these are exclusive spaces. These aren't spaces that everyone has equal access to. I mean, so many of the communities that I've worked in have only gotten electricity in the last couple of years, let alone internet, let alone using Zoom, access for elders to be able to have the technology to be able to have these conversations. So I think it's really applying that critical lens, applying that queer critical lens, and just being fully alive and present as a two-spirit person, and sort of lending those teachings wherever I can throughout the education that I do, regardless of whether it has anything to do with gender or sexuality, but how can I weave it into the conversation? Because that's the thing about being two-spirit, is it's this harmonization of culture, gender, sexuality, spirituality. It's how we use our bodies. It's how we think. It's how we feel. It's how we love. It's a harmonized way of being. It's not this siloed way of being, like, oh, this is what I do for work. This is my gender and sexuality. This is where I live. It's a way of really having all those things come together. And so it's important to me to carry those in all the ways that I do my work.
Thank you. Riley?
I still can't get over this metaphor that I'm speaking to from inside the closet. I need to come out of the closet to talk about, or I need to go back into the closet to talk about queer ed, because we're on Zoom. But Kyle's answer really resonated with me, which is taking up space, the importance of taking up space, which is what I think I contribute when I'm queering Indigenous land-based ed. Really using my body and using my appearance to, I guess, queer people's conceptions of two-spirit people, and being as truthful as I can to myself, and not letting me apply filters to that. I think I feel most at home when I'm on the land, so I would want to not try and put on appearances, and to be myself on the land, I think is one of the most important things. And in preparing for this, I was reminded of an experience I had at Dechinta, I think the last time I was there. And I had arrived at Dechinta already with a beard, so I was already looking pretty scruffy. And then when you get to Dechinta and you spend some time in the bush, you get even scruffier and smellier. So I was looking super masked, like super butch, wearing all my plaid flannels, things like that. And then one morning, I don't know why, but I just thought, okay, I want to shave. So I shaved my whole face, and then it was chilly that day. So I also grabbed one of the kukum scarves, the kukum or nukumis scarves, the grandma scarves. And I was wearing that like a kukum. And I reflecting on it now, it was actually almost like an act of drag, of changing my appearance and switching it up on people. And I remember I was walking by, and two of the old elders saw, and not even at me, they were whispering. They're they were laughing, just howling. They're I've never seen a man wear a kukum scarf like that. And I was just so happy to hear that, because how does that just quickly change their perception? And just something that I barely even thought of might, make someone think again. And I think that act of taking up space and just being true to myself could lay a seed probably for someone, if they start thinking about that, that'll grow in their mind, and maybe the next time they see me, I don't know, I do something else. But I think just taking up that space is so important, and having that visibility. It's like, I don't want to diminish it. It's like a very first step is just being present. But I think it's a really important step as well in this kind of long process of queering. And I've had similar experiences up here in my territory in Bigtugong. I think what I've tried to do, because I didn't grow up in Bigtugong, I grew up in Southern Ontario, urban for most of my life. So I didn't know many of the people in Bigtugong when I started coming back here a couple of years ago. I have relations here, but they're pretty distant. But what I tried to consciously do, because I was really worried about coming back to my community and, not knowing about kind of internalized Christian moralities, not knowing the situation which was up here. And what I started doing was just being very conscious about talking about my partner and using male pronouns. I was like, oh, he's a great gardener. He's a great baker. You'll love him. And just really stressing those pronouns just to take up that space and to normalize, I have a partner, he's male, deal with it. And I think I was just so pleasantly surprised when, some community members would respond with humor. I clearly remember an elder, after talking about my partner for a while, she was like, oh, if you didn't have that partner, I would have gone after you, and like winking at me. And it's just, I like howled with laughter. And I loved it because it's using that humor to queer. I think humor is a big part of queering. Yeah, me bitch.
Great, thank you. Yeah, sometimes just the things that we can be ordinary really can be shifting in terms of queering, but also like making people completely shift their understandings. It just reminded me of a story that maybe some of you have heard me tell it before, but with our land-based cohort, we always go to Hawaii as one of their courses as a study tour. And I have permission to tell this story. But the first time we went down into this one area, we were getting kind of a little introduction and tour of the site, and we were going to be staying down there for, a week or so. And there were 2 porta potties, and when we kind of got to that part, the woman that was taking us around, the elder, she said, explained kapu, or sacred law. And she said, this is the men's washroom and this is the women's washroom, porta potty. And that's part of our sacred law and all that. And I could see all the students kind of like turn to me like, what, is she going to say anything? And I had this dialogue in my head that probably like lasted a millisecond, but it seemed like it went on and on and on. And so I just looked and I said, there's 18 students that identify as female and 2 or 3 that identify as male. And then the elder kind of got it and said, oh, kapu is lifted. So that's how easy it can be, right? Sometimes we put all this whole history of values on, what's sacred and sacred law and tradition and all that, but really, can be as simple as lifting the kapu, so to speak. Leanne, did you want to add to or go on to the next kind of section?
I'll queer it and do both. So I really like this idea that Max and Alex talked about as queering as a practice, as a politic, and as an ethic. And I think I like this idea that Ryan talked about, that for me, I see that ethic and that practice in the land if you don't bring heteropatriarchy and a gender binary and transphobia onto it conceptually. And so a lot of what I think I've been trying to do is to destroy that kind of gender binary and amplify queerness, Indigenous queerness as a normal state, as a normal practice, and being able to take things in my territory like day, night, man, woman, and just leave that, but find a conceptual language to talk about how while you can find polarity in a binary in day and night, there's also, it is a cycle, and there is a different amount of light at every single point in the day, and that creates a circle. And sort of using that as a teaching to bring everybody into the circle, talking about individual self-determination, non-interference, respect for diversity, consent, sort of all of these Anishinaabe ethics that can, in traditional practices of ceremony and of land-based practices, get, I think, very Christianized and colonized, and used to exclude and to dishonor and to shame queerness. So part of that for me has been to engage kind of over the last 20 years with ceremonial leaders who are willing to talk about these things and who do not want to uphold those gender binaries, to create a practice around ceremony that's a safe space, or as a safe space as possible for queerness, and that does not practice half the lodge is man, half the lodge is woman, women in skirts, the kind of exclusionary taboos around menstruation and pregnancy, and sort of just destroy that and amplify the rest. And so it's also been really great in my territory to have Maddie here, and we were participants in the Canoe Project, and that's the first time I've ever participated in a land-based, queer land-based Indigenous education project that I didn't have to organize. And so it was amazing because I didn't have to do any of the background work. And at one point, my child, Miniwewe Benishi, was misgendered, and I was like, do you want me to say anything? And she was like, no, Maddie will take care of it. And so that was just having now sort of a little bit of a community around this at Dechinta, and then also in my own territory, my kids are just growing up with a completely different understanding of the world. So that's going to happen when they find out what's going on outside their little bubble. At Dechinta, we've been, this is something that we've been talking about and been practicing sometimes very successfully and sometimes not successfully for sort of the last decade. We have lots of Indigenous Dene women students. We have lots of queer students. We've had trans students through our program. And we recently did a fish camp in the winter, partnering with the Rainbow Coalition in Yellowknife. And so part of my responsibility there has been to have those conversations with our staff and with our elders. And I've taken that on because I'm not Dene, and so if it goes badly, then my family doesn't get impacted. I can still come back and make canoes with Maddie. But it hasn't actually, well, yeah, it has. There's been some times that it's gone badly, and we've had to not have those elders back. But for our YKDF and elders, they've been really, really amazing and really supportive. Although, like Maddie said, it's been, the language has been, because their first language isn't English and because they don't know the terminology, the conversations are actually really funny, but it's often takes a bit to get to the root of what I'm asking. And then I've also had lots and lots of questions or conversations with Anishinaabe elders trying to find this way, this queer way with inside our culture and with inside our knowledge system that it's different than the way Anishinaabe culture and ceremony is traditionally enacted. And that's been really great, because you don't have to say Father Sky, and you don't have to say Mother Earth, and you don't have to say Grandmother Moon. You don't have to gender everything all the time. There are actually lots of other words that were more normalized in the past that we can bring up. I think I've learned so much from trans students and from queer students. When I was teaching in Alex's program, we were camped by a Tikmik lake, beautiful lake. We had about 20 or 30 Indigenous students who were teachers. there was a transphobic joke told, and a student came and asked me to intervene. I went and talked to the student, I talked to the class, I patted myself on the back because I thought I did a great job, and the student came back and said, like, that actually sucked, that was superficial, and you did not get to the bottom of anything. And I was like, okay. So I spent that night with the mosquitoes, sharing the cabin with Alex, trying to figure out what I was going to do the next day. And so we ended up taking space, and we took the whole day. And I talked in more detail, more specific, was braver, was more vulnerable. And then all of the teachers actually had so many stories about trans students in their class, about having to intervene with their parents, about having to intervene with social services. And we ended up taking the whole day to talk about that issue. And I would not have done that had I not been willing to listen and really hear and affirm that student and break down that binary with boundaries between student and teacher. And so that was a really, really valuable teaching for me. It's something that I've really taken, I will always remember, and I will take with me forward from Alex's class. So the next part of the question is sort of what's working, what are you doing? What are you doing in your own lab, in your own practices, in your own research to queer your work? Max, are you happy to be called upon?
Yeah. I always sit in the front at events because I'm so short. So this is kind of just like that again. So it's good. So what are you doing? So I think I'll talk about two different flavors of things that's happening. The first thing, so again, I do both what scientists called field work, but we call either homework or homeland work or land and water work because there's no field that isn't a home and it's super rude, but also laboratory work. And so I spend a lot of time, and I think it is working, is that teaching folks that you're always in relation with the land, even if you're not out there in the bush or on the land or going out, it's called here. If you're in the lab, in the university, in the concrete room with your eyeball to a microscope, you're engaging in land relations. And all the principles that you feel so strongly when you're out on the horizon in the sky are also true when you're looking through the microscope. And so what does that look like? What does that mean? What are you doing with the sample that you would do with a moose? Because samples are much less charismatic than moose. That helps a lot with the nature, not nature binary or urban nature, like a lot of the purity discourses that I think Ryan and other folks have been talking about too. Plastics are land. Oil is land. They're horribly abused land. They've been set up to fail land. It's like not cool. They're traumatized land, you might think, but they're still land. And so the question that I always present to the lab is, how do you do good kinship with bad kin? There's still, and you know this, especially as queer folks, you know this, especially if you're Métis, right? We're all about making kin, but we got so many assholes. So how we know how to maneuver those, right? Leanne just said, like, break down binaries, but with good boundaries. Like, yes. So what does that look like when the task I give them is like, how do you love plastics, right? That means that love cannot be like this wonderful rising thing that makes you feel good in your chest. That's not what love can be. What is love if you're loving plastics and plastics are land? And the students spend usually years working on that project. And the best results of that question have been people breaking up with their significant others when they realized there wasn't actually any love, because they can love plastics better than they can love their significant other, because they were relying on that good feeling to be the foundation of certain relationships. And I'm like, yes, breakups are the best scientific sort of results we've gotten so far, I think, coming out of those sorts of lessons. But that's sort of like an abstract way to talk about what we do, which I usually find very annoying when people talk about abstracts and sort of talk about things discursively. The main way that we talk about what we do and what works is to talk about protocol. And when I say protocol, I mean it both in the scientific and the ceremonial sense, which basically just means all the steps you do in the order so that you are oriented towards the good and you are always reproducing the goods and your feet are always pointing towards the good horizon and they're not straying to these other horizons. And it's exactly the same in science as it is in ceremony in those terms. And I think too, going back to part of what Ryan was talking about, like when you talk about protocol and link it back to science, people sort of drop some of the like pretentious, sacred, super macho sort of things that happen because you sort of go back and forth between the sacred and the scientific, and those start to get blurry, which also means it's harder to be purist. So what does that look like? So one of the binary things that we work on not doing is live and not live. So we only work with dead things in our lab. We don't work with any live animals. We work with a lot of animal guts and we look in them for plastics. And so students are taught about how those guts are still animals and those guts are still land and those guts are, you still have responsibilities to them the same as when the moose is walking around and you can make eye contact with it. So that means you don't wear earbuds when you're working with your samples and cutting it off. It means that you don't take gory photos. It means that if you have like rising feels of grossness, that's you dealing with yourself and you need to go deal with yourself and those feelings of grossness because they are not coming from the sample. They are coming from you. What's up? Same with, and I use the example of sex all the time. If you're in the middle of sex and something's super gross, that's about you. That has nothing to do with the bodies that are happening, right? Oh, okay, yeah, so students sort of get that a little better. Whenever I compare something to sex, students get it better for some reason. I think because they spend a lot of time thinking about sex. And then at the end, we repatriate all our guts back to the land, right? So basically, we throw them in the water with nice words, sort of ceremonial, but without, yeah, it's basically ceremonial. Sometimes elders come and talk to us about what's happening. There's also super boring things like we don't sex all our animals, or even better, I try and get the students to sex dead animals. Have you ever tried to sex a fish? It's super hard. It's super, super hard. Or sexing a dead goose. That's also very hard. So if you've ever sexed a live goose, I don't know if you have, but you flip them over upside down, and if it's a boy goose or a goose with a penis, its little penis pokes out. But when the goose is dead, that doesn't always happen. And so you end up with geese that have penises and geese that don't, but the geese that don't have penises aren't necessarily female geese. And so what do you do with that? And so we leave a bunch of, we have geese with penises and geese without penises that are dead. And those are our scientific categories. And I teach the students how those are proper scientific categories and how they also, you know, basically through trying to sex things that are almost impossible to sex, they then start thinking about how that's also impossible with animals that aren't geese and aren't fish and are human, if they weren't already there. And yeah. And then I think the last thing we do that's successful, and this goes back to just what Madeline was saying, is when I ask the students, like, what's the coolest thing about our lab? Because we do all these feminist and anti-colonial things, like repatriating guts, and they're like, oh, the best thing about the lab is it's a good place to eat my lunch. I'm like, really? That's the cool? No, we're so cool. We do this cool stuff. Look at the theory. Look at our publications. Look at it. They're like, no, it's a good place to eat my lunch. So it's just, especially where I am in St. John's, Newfoundland, it is so painfully homogenous here. We have what's called a founding, what is it called? Founding population. Everyone is so close, all the settlers are so closely genetically related that they are almost a pure genetic group that scientists come to and do experiments on, right? They're more pure than any Indigenous group pretty much in the world, genetically. That's how, it's not only white, there's only one kind of white. It's not just sex, there's only one kind of sex. It's not just straight, there's only one kind of straight. And I never thought I'd miss a diversity of white people until I came and lived here. Because it's so, that there's a good place to eat your lunch where no one gives a shit about what your pronouns are or what your deal. The most interesting thing is, hey, what's in your sandwich? As opposed to any other question that might be out there, is actually very significant in this space in a way that I underestimated when I first came. I came here from New York City, right? It's a totally different ballgame here. The politics are fundamentally different when you live in a colony. This is still very much a colony. So thank you.
Does someone want to jump in organically and kind of deepen the conversation or you guys want me to pick? I'm going to pick Maddie because I know you have to go at 5:30. So why don't you go next and get it all out?
Thanks, Leanne. Yeah, I do have to go at 5:30. That's it. I just want to apologize for that. And if I don't make it to the next round of questions, yeah, a lot of what you. I mean, I'm a geographer, but I'm a human geographer. So I'm really appreciating listening to you talk about like working in a lab and working on the scientific side, because there are scientists in my department that I'm like, I don't know how to talk to you, and just listening to you talk, Max, about like the way you engage in your work relationally is sort of helping me. I would like a follow-up conversation about that. Yeah, so I like the way you said that you're always in a relation with the land no matter where you are, and I think that that idea I have been trying to bring into my everyday life, especially during pandemic, quarantine, lockdown times, just thinking about it feels like I'm more in my place than ever before, and my relational world has somehow never felt smaller than ever before at the same time, like and so I think my human relational world, I should say. So I think going out, we live right next to a creek and like a big forested area. We live in the city, like in the middle of the city, but there's a giant park that runs right through the city. So every single day, going out and walking in the park for hours at a time, which I didn't have time for before we were at home, made me, I was able to be with all of the progression, all of the changes for spring, and see the fiddleheads as they were coming up. And instead of going out and picking a whole bunch all at once, I would pick like a handful in the morning and come home and eat them, and sort of, I think, like rethinking the way we are in place, and having an opportunity, like you said, Ryan, to slow down. And I was thinking like about that question in terms of education, like what is working? I was like, I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think what is working, what feels like it's working so far is sort of, and I think this is something that everyone has touched on a little bit, is talking to each other. And like, I mean, Leanne, you talked about how you took time and you took space, and you said more and you gave more details, and I think, Max, you're talking a lot about like changing the way that we talk about things, and how we communicate about beyond the binary, and just kind of bringing conversations to the forefront has been so far what has been working for me. That's what in education. And I think, Riley, I really appreciated your story about, talking about your partner in community, and sort of, making that point and bringing that to the forefront. And I think I have thought a lot about coming out and being out in Anishinaabe territory, where, my mom tells stories about growing up on the reserve, and like the intense homophobia that was there, and queer people of her generation who you know, left and never came back. And I feel like now when I am around, people are just kind of like, oh, okay. I like the change in attitude has been so dramatic. And I think you know, in my family, people were just kind of like, yeah, okay, that's great. Moving on, next topic. And so people don't seem like, we talk about normativity and what is normal for us. And I think what I have witnessed a lot has been people being like, yeah, this is fine, this is normal. We just carry on with what you're doing. And that, it's kind of funny because I think sometimes the way we think about queerness, we define it so much by difference, by like what is different from the norm. And so to see it as just like part of us, part of everything, and to have other people in the community who don't identify as queer see it that way too, has been kind of cool. And I feel like there are so many more things that everyone has said that I want to talk about, but I'm going to pause there so I can listen to you all talk some more.
Does anyone want to jump in?
Sure, I will. Yeah, because I just want to sort of follow up on what Maddie was saying, and then also as what Max was talking about before as well, is in terms of relationality. Like that's one of the ways that I feel I'm sort of queer in my land-based education, is talking about relationality. So in a couple of different ways. So, I mean, as a trans person, like when you name yourself as trans, when you come out, and especially when you sort of go on any sort of like physical transformation journey through like hormones or surgery or anything like that, it's a really exposing process. It all of a sudden feels that you are wearing on the outside of your body all the things that go on inside your head for everyone to see. And it can be a really, it can be, again, like a really exposing process. And I think that out of that comes just a need to have just a sense of humility and just be able to be comfortable, be comfortable being yourself, take joy in being yourself. And in those awkward moments, like, I know this one time I was doing a workshop with a colleague. We were up in northern BC, and we were supposed to be there for like a big event at the Friendship Center taking place. We were doing a gender diversity workshop around creating welcoming spaces for two-spirit people. And just the way the day was going, so many of the folks weren't able to all be in the room at the same time. So there was a lot of coming and going. And so we wound up canceling the workshop and just sitting around. It was me and my coworker and about like 10 to 12 like moms and aunties who were just like working at the Friendship Center to make the food and create the welcoming space and just be there with everyone. And we just sat around telling stories about the first time using a new bathroom and some of the ridiculous and hilarious things that have happened, and just coming up with those stories of like awkward moments and just really being in ourselves and showing up entirely. And so much of what like queering Indigenous education, like land-based or not, for me is about, is really just sort of holding that dual role of being able to show up with humility, being yourself. And, you know, if we're doing a workshop where we're all eating, that's fine. I don't need to stand up there in a suit with a laser pointer. Like, let's sit down, let's eat some sandwiches and just talk about this topic. We don't need to come in there and be off-putting, right? We need to welcome people in. We need to build those relationships and take down those walls. And so it's that one side of having that humility, just being your comfortable self, but then also having that respect for protocols. So it's sitting around delivering a workshop while you're sitting there eating a sandwich and knowing this elder is speaking. They may have been speaking for 45 minutes in the workshop, but they're going to be speaking now. And we're all going to be listening because this is going to come full circle. And it's about being able to respect those things that are very sort of hard and fast rules, those protocols, at the same time as just being your relaxed self. And I think for me, just taking those walls down, having that humility, having that openness and telling those stories is what is going to create space for some of that some of that place-based change through doing those land acknowledgements. So again, that's what I'm mainly focusing on in my work. And I need to be able to cultivate a relationship with my coworkers, with other people at the university, so that someone is comfortable enough to come to me and say, I'm so uncomfortable when I see this on the agenda to do a land acknowledgement. I look for the first Indigenous person and ask them to do it. I need to be able to cultivate that level of comfort and humility with other people as well, so that we can work from where they're at. Because I don't want someone coming to me saying, can you please give me this statement to look up my territory on Native land, and then I can just plug what I find in there so I can read that off the agenda. I need people to be able to feel comfortable and open to be able to come and actually engage in that process and do that education. And also to further the idea of relationality, like, what is your relationship to land? Because that's how you're going to have a meaningful acknowledgement, is understanding, like, these are things I've noticed. Here is how the ground feels near my home. Here's a sacred spot that I go to. Here is something that I see out my window all the time. Here's the lands that I grew up on that I didn't know anything about the lands. But in retrospect, I want to do that honor now, and I want to revisit where I did grow up. I want to talk about where I was born, how my family came to settle on these territories. So we need to have so much relationality just really needs to be at the heart of being able to do acknowledgements for people. And so being able to have that skill, that insight, that reflection as a queer person, to just be able to relax and be yourself, is sort of how I try to cultivate that to bring us to a good place to have those good relationships and further that work together. Yeah. Messy.
I can go if you want. I don't think I have enough experience to be able to comment on definitively what works in land-based ed. I do consider myself more of a student in land-based ed than I am an educator. But I do feel that I return back to taking up those different roles. And at our elder camp up here in Big Dagong, I made sure of taking up different roles simultaneously. So being called upon to chop wood because I'm a tall cis male, that was natural for someone to ask me to do that. But then to, after that, make a point of going into the kitchen and helping the cooks, and inhibiting those different spaces that were clearly divided by gender, but being able to show how it was natural for me to inhibit both spaces in the camp, I think was important. Earlier, I mentioned how fashion is queer, and I think I need to do a bit more thinking about why that is, beyond the fact that so many queer people are attracted to fashion. But I think, Kyle, what you spoke about in being able to fashion what you feel on the inside outside, I think is really, really important. And at the School of Fashion, we've been really working on tearing away that gender binary, so students can create non-binary collections, and we've broadened the range of what you can design in terms of size, and body abilities. And I think also encouraging a kind of politics with students as they design, to really say what they want to say, and to not feel censored in what they design. I think, taking up space is also, for me, it's a responsibility to create space, because as the School of Fashion is paying more attention to Indigenous design, I was really grateful that we started a beading circle, but I noticed a lot of my queer friends weren't coming to the beading circle, and so I spoke to them and realized that we needed a queer two-spirit beading circle separately. It wasn't enough just to create an Indigenous space to gather. It was essential in creating a queer Indigenous space to gather. And I think that's where the magic happens, is when you're able to sit in a circle and spend time with each other. Like a lot of people here have mentioned, it's just being able to speak freely and build those relations, I think, is key.
Riley, I was thinking, Riley just finished his comps. Hooray. But during your comps, I was thinking, you were talking a lot about the land and bringing the ethics of the land and caring for the land into the fashion world, and how that was conflicting a lot with capitalism. And I thought that that's actually a way of Indigenous queering the fashion industry. And it gets back to this idea that even if we're not on the land, we're still in relation with the land.
Yeah, I think the values that come from Indigenous fashion all come from the land because it is so intimately connected. So when you're doing a process like hide tanning, for example, you're really modeling you're modeling collaboration, you're modeling respect and reciprocity, and it takes a whole community to create Indigenous fashion, I think. In Western fashion, there's this notion of like the designer that's a genius, and they see visions and they're able to articulate them and they design them. And the production of that is all removed. But in Indigenous fashion, it's so dependent on community members working together. And I think that is, it's a method of queering fashion. Yeah.
Brian?
I think for me, the way that I understand this is, on one hand, like I do a lot of contract work in my community where I have assisted different child and family organizations try and get accredited because it's part of their funding arrangement that they have. And so for me, I find that really a frustrating process. As I've mentioned before, it kind of follows that neoliberal evidence-based kind of funding formula. But I'm outside of kind of doing that kind of work. I'm also a member of the Sikabuta Sigs, or Grey Horse Society, where I'm a partner to Abakabistan, which is the leadership bundle in one of our sacred societies in my community. And as a member of the society, I really have a lot of like rights and privileges that I didn't realize. This society is kind of like where you begin your path to acquiring certain rights and transfers to be able to conduct ceremony and be recognized as like a sanctioned kind of knowledge keeper or elder later on. And so I didn't realize this because I was approached to join as a partner to this to the bundle holders that I'm a part of, and I didn't realize like that there's a lot of power that comes with being in this position. There's also a lot of like strict rules that follow those exclusive gender protocols, which has not been easy because I find myself in those spaces where I'm most frustrated with the way ceremony is kind of conceptualized, where it's kind of enacted along, maybe not in like actual like blatant forms of anti-queer violence, but it's definitely still there, those sentiments. But being in this role, I also have a lot of access to elders and knowledge keepers, and it kind of goes back to what everyone else has been saying, is that it's allowed me to kind of take up more space, to ask those kinds of hard questions, and to really start to kind of make visible a lot of the concerns and experiences of not just myself, but this problem that has of anti-queer violence within kind of Blackfoot spaces, and to kind of make that more visible for a lot of people to see and to hear. And it's exhausting work. It's not always, I guess, this. I feel like sometimes doing land-based learning can get romanticized, and it's always super fun, and it's always like we're camping, and it kind of falls into those tropes sometimes, but it's a lot of work. And I myself, I'm allergic to almost everything. And so I have a really interesting relationship with the land where I'm out there. Part of one of the responsibilities I have is I have to ride a horse, and I'm allergic to horsehair. I'm allergic to hay. And so it's just interesting to kind of reflect on even my own body is telling me that this relationship is not it's not all this kind of romanticized, being on the land is where it's at. And I'm not saying it's not, but it's a lot more complicated and nuanced to that. And so I think for me, acknowledging that it's a process. It's about how to be in relationship with pain. For a lot of us, it's painful to be in those spaces. It's painful to for me to engage in certain kinds of ceremonial practices. Like just the other day, I had to go up to the mountains and harvest a jack pine tree for one of our it's like a staff that we put our bundles on. And so that in and of itself was like really a lot of work, and it took a lot out of me. And so it's about knowing your what you're capable of doing. It's knowing your limitations, but it's also about being in relationship with pain, being in relationship with knowing that you're going to be in situations that are contentious, and we can't always avoid that. And I myself do not like conflict. I am a 6'3" Blackfoot Indian man that it just looks intimidating to a lot of people, but I hate conflict. I just don't like it. And so for me, it's just this interesting, it's been this interesting experience where being involved in this society, I've been able to learn a lot about place-based kind of relational politics and ethics and teachings, but I've also learned a lot about myself and what it means to do this kind of work. And it's it's really about kind of being in that relationship with, at least for me, that conflict, and knowing when it's okay to kind of question, and knowing when it's okay to challenge these kinds of conceptions that people may have, and also to know when you are tired and exhausted, and you, for your own well-being, you just don't have it in you to continuously do that all the time. And for me, learning that that's okay, that at least in this, while I'm involved in this group, I'm acquiring this different kind of knowledge from elders, and I see it as a way for me to kind of start to eventually, kind of what Leanne has been talking about, is making ceremony a safe space for others. And so the way that kind of Blackfoot societies as a governance unit function are, that's how we pass down and still pass down the knowledge around kind of place-based or land-based education. It's not tethered to any kind of Western or colonial funding framework. That it's a very structured way of passing on knowledge. And so that has kind of been my way of seeing the best way to acquire this knowledge, and then to start taking up more space, to start challenging a lot of these gendered ways of thinking that reinforce heteronormativity and anti-queer violence. And so part of being in this role as well is that there was another individual who, and I had permission to share this story, who approached the leader, the current leader of this society that I'm part of, and was able to create a queer Blackfoot social society modeled after traditional Blackfoot governance practices, where it was publicly acknowledged and witnessed at our Sundance ceremony. And so it's actually in many ways recognized now as being part of Blackfoot law. Like, this is a recognized society. We were able to get it recognized at our Sundance. And so it's still in its infancy, but through creating this, we've actually been able to have more queer Blackfoot folks come together. And again, it goes back to just talking and sharing our stories. And in sharing those stories, it's actually allowed us to create our own world, to create our own space. And that goes back to kind of what Riley was saying with some of the queer folks wanting to start their own kind of eating circle, is that this was, while we want to have not just queer folks do this kind of work, it's also, I think, a desire to have our own space to be able to have these conversations on our own terms without having to worry about if somebody's going to interject or question what we're doing. It allows us to kind of be creative and to be in relation with these teachings on our own terms. And so what we're now planning to do is we have our own kind of teepee that we set up at the Sundance every year, and it allows us to kind of make ourselves known to the community, that it's not just that we're at the periphery anymore, we're actively like in the center at the Sundance. And so that's just, for me, one of the ways I see this working outside of the other work I do with working with organizations that are tied to this strict kind of neoliberal funding model, is that we don't have to worry about that a lot of it is just what we're able to do. And I think for a lot of us, we didn't realize how much influence we can actually like make just by relying on each other, and just by kind of bringing our voices together, is that there's a lot of power that we actually have that we don't realize we have. And so this is kind of what I've seen working, although it's still, again, challenging because we still have to deal with a lot of that pushback from community. But it's something that a lot of people that are part of that older generation didn't actually think would be possible within a Blackfoot context, to have a Blackfoot kind of queer social society. So yeah, that's just kind of how I've been thinking through this question.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Alex?
Hi there. So we've kind of covered some of these questions in just our discussion so far. And I was thinking about how, sometimes our land-based education programs or programming does kind of replicate colonial structures. And I know that all of you are working to undo that. And it is really difficult sometimes when you're working with elders that have such entrenched ideas on whether, you can't really have a conversation with them and say like, this is colonial violence, because they don't talk that way. So it's a really gentle kind of path forward that we have to follow. And one of the things that I've found here anyway is that it takes a lot of time to do that kind of relational vetting, I guess, to see who's going to be working with students, especially younger students and women or queer people as well. And there have been times when, you go to a community and people tell you right away, like, who to stay away from. And that's been kind of not a challenge, but I think that's something that has been working here in Oceania, at least, that we spend a lot of time knowing our family relations and knowing who's not going to make a joke, hopefully, or who's not going to do exclusionary practices. And I found that for every person that says, that creates a binary within their ceremonial space, you can go and find someone that doesn't. So that's kind of the hard work that we have to do too, is just to just accept and then kind of find someone that doesn't do that kind of binary work within a ceremonial space, because sometimes people think it's not as legit, but in fact it is. And those people are out there. So the next thing we wanted to kind of talk about, maybe some of the barriers for queer Indigenous people in terms of participating in Indigenous land-based education. And let's just open it up for anyone who kind of wants to speak to that.
I think it's been touched on earlier, but Leanne mentioned the jokes. And I think, we do just have to pay so much attention to those like often kind of like casual jokes or subtle stigmas that come up, and address them, I think, when they happen, like you did, Leanne. When I told that story about the elders kind of laughing at my kukum scarf, I think I was mature enough and in a place to kind of understand why they were laughing, and I didn't take offense by it. But a student who's not as equipped to deal with that situation might not have taken it that way. And I think those are the kind of things that can really eat at you and can kind of rain on your overall experience if it's not addressed. So I think establishing, through governance circles, as we do at Dechinta, establishing that you're able to bring things up that you might initially be shy to bring something up, but for sure bring anything to the attention of the group that's bothering you, because it can ruin things for your experience. I remember another story. We were talking about love in the bush and what love in the bush might look like. And I was being very forward about, what my views and being open about my sexuality. And we were talking about the term Two-Spirit and how it kind of encapsulates a whole bunch of different traditions. And I made a joke about, I can see myself having a role in the bush with a whole bunch of men, and making a joke about that. And someone kind of they scrunched up their face and said, "Oh, you mean like Brokeback Mountain?" and made a joke about that. And a few of them laughed, and I was able to kind of unpack it and be like, well, actually, I kind of do mean that, and we were able to talk about that. But I think so. Not everyone is going to be equipped to hear a joke like that, or to hear an offhand remark like that, and be able to address it. So I think, it's important to think about those things.
Should we move on to the next question?
I'm actually just gonna. I have just a couple of things to add. So, in my own work, particularly at Dechinta, I see part of my responsibilities of having these more difficult conversations ahead of time with staff and with elders to try and prevent and try and create a safer space for students, so that when Riley is rocking his kukum scarf, people are okay with it ahead of time, but also thinking through things like outhouses and bathrooms and swimming and accommodations and our application forms, thinking through all of those things, having lots of queer Indigenous staff on site that are actively, and different personalities, sort of a diversity, so that everybody, like Kyle is talking about, can connect with somebody and feels like they have a space that they're going to be affirmed and they're going to be listened to, having the governance circles, doing a lot of modeling. So the Dene are so much better at this than the Anishinaabe, but because they're closer to the land, but they're very much like, you need to know, all genders need to know all of the skills as a matter of survival. So men need to be sewing and cooking in case you're in the bush alone and you need to do all of those things. Women need to know how to hunt, and then using that, which is binary, but then breaking it down further and having people model doing all of that, and having folks on site like Maddie and Riley who are actively jamming any kind of spaces that happen, so that our students are sort of more immersed in that and can find somebody, if stuff comes up, they can find somebody that they trust to talk to. So yeah, our next, Alex, I'll just maybe go on to our next question. We've sort of talked about how our programs are making the land a safer space, even in terms of and Max's lab being like a lunchroom. How's the pandemic and how is the move to Zoom-based learning to online learning impacting all of this. So this is something that we've been really thinking through at Dechinta. We're in the north, people don't have access to computers, they don't have access to internet. The elders and leadership are saying the safest place is on the land. Our institutions are really pushing for online learning. We're worried that if we do a really great job of online learning, they will never get to go on the land again because it's cheaper just to have webinars. So how is the, I actually found Max's work because I was trying to think of like things that you can do on the land on your own. So what are the opportunities? What are some of the risks? What are the ethics? How are people coping with the pandemic?
If I could start, that would be great, because I'm super hungry and I'm going to go soon. Because this has all been my dinner time. So this is something that has been, at first I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So our entire lab moved online almost overnight with almost no prep. And at first I was like, this is amazing, because what I've been trying to teach these folks for so long is that the land is here. It is your computer, and ignoring that is bad land relations. And your computer's not going to work after a while because you keep ignoring those relations. So at first I was super pumped, and that it would be a harder lesson, but a clearer lesson to talk about how your monitor is in the land relation. And when you're sitting in your room, that's a land relation, you know. I had some mentees who were like, well, I can't do the steps we would normally do when we're out on the land. I'm like, well, imagine you're out on the land. What's the first thing you do when it's time to gain knowledge, like in the sort of homework sort of thing? And they say, oh, well, the first thing you do is listen. I'm like, okay, what you do? First thing you do is listen. Sit there and listen. And they've probably never in their urban space sat down and actually listened as opposed to block out noise before. And so like, oh, right. So they learn certain things. Okay, what's step number 2? Well, long-term slow observation. You know, usually I'd be watching the water or watching the ice or watching the whatever. Okay, well, pick something in your space, in your house, and watch it like you would watch the water. And almost everyone in the lab chose like a houseplant, which is because they weren't quite ready. But one of the students watched her blinds, her like Venetian blinds, because she thought, I think, that she was going to watch the quality of the light change over time. But on the lab meeting, she said, I was noticing the dust accumulate, and one day there was red dust, and that was the day I wore my red fuzzy bathrobe all day because I was sad. And I was like, yes, plastic is a main component of house dust now, and that's new. And so then we did all these lessons about plastic contamination and house dust and all the issues that go with plastic pollution in the air you breathe in your house dust. And where's the most house dust? On the ground. Who's on the ground? Animals and babies. What does that mean, right? So it worked really well, the way it's supposed to work in the bush. So that was really good. But at the same time, I have come to realize there's certain things that I teach that really depend on there being a dead fish there. Like really for real. And I can't kind of fake that. And so there's been a lot of like, okay, what do we release and what do we not release? And how do we do, one of the main principles of land-based education, or whatever you want to call it, is you learn in the doing. Well, what are we doing right now? And that's been something that I need to work on. Like, how are we getting our food? Okay, in that case, how do we apply the principles of food sovereignty to that when we are not allowed to go to grocery stores? Right? So there's still some things that I don't know how to work on. But one of the things actually I was talking to Alex about that we're going to do in August when we both have minutes is I use drawing a lot in the bush, but it works here. Is one of the things about drawing, if you learn how to draw properly, is that it's all about seeing. So one of the exercises, we can actually do one of the exercises right now. You want to do an exercise about seeing in the bush? Okay. So I think we usually use a pine cone in the bush or something, but I think it works. Like if you just choose a part of the room you're in and you look at the line between the ceiling and the wall, and just try, it's a line, right? It's a line, but try to move your eye very slowly and continuously along that line as if it's a continuous thread, and pay attention to how your eyes, and do it slow as you can, Try and make your eyes move along that smoothly. What happened to your eyes? Did it go so smooth? No, your eyes go in little, it goes in little jerks, and your eyes only go in little jerks. You have never in your life seen a continuous line. It is actually impossible. What happens is your brain fills in between the lines and says, oh yeah, man, there's lines everywhere. Don't worry about it. Go straight. There is no straight. There has never been straight. All the ways of the world, there's never been straight. Your eyes fill in the blank. And one of the things that I think anti-colonialism, decolonization, land-based, it teaches you to stop listening to your brain and just notice what's happening, because your brain is filling in the gaps, and it's often filling in the gaps with bullshit. Right? With like binaries and things you think you already know, but you don't know. You think you've seen a line. You've never seen a line. And take that as the basis for learning about land. Right? And so we spend a lot of time drawing and training our eyes to see things without thinking, so that then we can do that with other parts of the scientific method too, or like what I would just call knowing things. So yeah, that's what we do in COVID times. Look at lines. Try not to know them.
You just blew my mind there a little bit, Max.
Just you wait till our official drawing lesson, Alex. It gets better. That's the intro.
Sure, I can go. Yeah, so how's the pandemic impacting all of this, and sort of the opportunities and risks involved? So I would say number one way that the pandemic has impacted me or my life or my work in terms of queering Indigenous land-based education is pretty specific. So the way I think I'm even connected with this call right now is I actually had a trip planned to Yellowknife, to Dechinta, to come home and see some of my family and spend a couple of weeks there, and present some of the work that I've done so far in my master's research. And it was sort of part of my preparation process, sort of what Margaret Kovach talks a little bit about, that preparation into doing Indigenous research is really developing a relationship with your topic, developing a relationship with yourself and with your work. And so part of that for me was being able to come home to Dene territory to have a bit better understanding of my methodology, of my epistemology. And my trip was scheduled for March 19th to 31st. And so it was that magical March 13th day that everyone remembers, that everything just seems to have officially come to a halt. And I mean, there wasn't necessarily travel restrictions or anything at the time, but it was just sort of a sense between myself and my partner, like, we've got like parkas in a box and like food ordered to the post office and the Airbnb and the flights and everything. But we were just like, this just doesn't feel right. And then some of the stuff that that I was looking forward to doing up in Yellowknife was a conversation with community members, including elders, about gender diversity, about Two-Spirit, anything in Dene communities. Like, what are some of the conversations that have been had? Let's even start to talk about it if they're not being had. And so that's something I was really looking forward to getting to experience. And also, I haven't been up to the north since I was a kid. And so, I was really looking forward to being up there just in the wintertime and just being on that territory. And unfortunately it was canceled. So that's one of the ways that it's impacted. And also just that ability to have that epistemology to inform how I am doing my work, like Dene laws or like, grandfather teachings, like just ways of guiding my process in my work for how to do protocol. Those sorts of things are now missed from my work more than they would have been if I had spent that time. And so now what I'm doing is I'm trying to cobble together the protocols that I know based on the territories that I've lived on and participated in, as well as trying to gain any further insight that I can through connecting to family members online, connecting with any sort of online resources like Dene A Journey, and like watching these things to like try and increase my knowledge base so that I can make sure that I have something that is nation specific to me informed in my work, and not just in other nations that are not necessarily home to me. so that's one of the direct ways it's sort of impacted and kind of thrown off that process for me. But I would say in terms of the paid work that I do in my role at UBC, the way it's impacted is that I came into that role in the second or third week of everyone working from home. And so that's the department that I work in is sort of the department that folks go to when they're wanting to take their courses online, and mentoring them through good teaching practices, how to sort of make that transition. And then sort of the smaller department I work in is focuses on Indigenous approaches to pedagogy. And so, so I came in, and that was what everyone was taking the opportunity to do, is that if they weren't doing land acknowledgements in their coursework or sort of in their in-person courses, they needed to start doing this in their online work. It was now a perfect opportunity. So it has been such a great opportunity to meet with staff around redesigning their program, and for an online format, how do they incorporate Indigenous content? How do they incorporate Indigenous worldview into the ways that they're designing their programs? How do they increase access for Indigenous students and staff and faculty, increasing the trainings that we now have online? So with everything shifting online, it's actually created a world of opportunities for those things. And at the same time, so much of what informs my work and informs the way I approach my work is conversations with elders, is witnessing conversations between elders. And that's something that I've really missed. I've had, I think, maybe only 1 to 2 chances in the last few months to sit amongst a group of elders. And I knew that it was something I was missing out on. But then last week, the Indigenous Education Department at UBC had a series of events. And one of the days was just tea with elders. And we sat for an hour and a half and just, they're talking about the weather, talking about COVID, but then, but as happens when you're having those conversations or witnessing those conversations with elders, these incredible moments of wisdom just come out of conversation. And that's, I had 3 different moments or 3 different things that just landed on my heart that I'm able to carry with me that have actually shifted how I work, even just in the last week, how I walk through the woods near my house, how I do my relations, how I do my own relation with myself in terms of my own mental health, emotional health, physical, spiritual health. And so that's been something that is a bit of a risk, because so much of my work relies on elder teachings. And so as we move online, that's really been a decrease. So it's something that I'm really looking forward to having more of when we get back to in-person, and also other supports to ensure that we do have more access to conversations with elders online. Yeah, messy.
So I did just want to mention, I think, Kyle, you mentioned how your partner was going to come with you up to Dechinta, which I think is so great. I think it's so important for queer partners to also partake in land-based ed. I know Dechinta made a point of bringing families and making space for mothers and those with kids to bring their whole family up to the land. And I think the same invitation should be extended and encouraged to queer partners, so that students and community members can see queer partners, and we can start hacking away at that being just normal. In terms of the pandemic, I kind of see 2 patterns. Some people are forging ahead with land-based ed, and some people are taking the time to pause. And I think that's very fair and valid to kind of take time to rest and recover. Zoom fatigue is for sure real. I'm a part of Powwow, however, and very early on we made a decision to move Powwow online entirely. We just couldn't ethically take that risk of bringing so many knowledge holders and elders and dancers together in one space. We kind of toyed with the idea of doing a social distance powwow where we could live stream it, but even the thought of bringing, say, 100 dancers together, we didn't want to. So we're pre-recording everything, and land-based activities was actually supposed to be a part of the powwow. We work with Ryerson's Science Department and Amber Sandy, who's the Indigenous liaison at the Sci Exchange. We were supposed to do high tanning at the quad, which is really, really powerful because it's right in the middle of campus, and there's a fire burning the whole time, and it really just claims space, which is so important at Ryerson in particular because it's so urban. But instead of hide tanning, we are making the shift to working with fish skins and fish scales, which is something that anyone can do from home. In fact, Amber encourages people to go to a local sushi restaurant and request skins, and they're often happy to give you fish skins. And Amber has been actually using Instagram to stream the process for tanning fish, get fish leather. And we're also going to be using that for the School of Fashion, because I think it's just such a beautiful material that you get from the end, and I think students would be happy to engage in that process and then design something with that fish skin. And I think you get a lot of those same lessons, persistence, and it's just as hard of a process to do. But I think that's one way that I think you can use scale to try and bring land-based ed into people's houses. I think with the caveat that you maybe think through the content that accompanies those activities, and probably be available for questions, because you can't mimic that social setting on the land. And then in Bektagong, we were supposed to be working on a food cultivation project, particularly with the youth. We were going to be building some raised beds and getting youth involved in gardening. And we've hit pause on that project as well. I think in part, we're okay with that decision because of the risk involved. And I think we pivoted to Facebook, actually, because so many community members are on Facebook. And we just started a cultivation group where gardeners can post their own gardens. And I think the logic behind that was just getting people excited about gardening and sharing little tidbits of knowledge, so that when we do get back, maybe next summer, maybe the summer after that, we have a community of gardeners who are excited to get together and work on kind of a larger community-wide project. Sorry, in terms of the powwow, I think it was also really important that we went online, because so many of the organizations in Toronto that would normally be hosting their own powwows, Native Women's Association, the Toronto Men's Residents, they are so focused on frontline services and keeping their clients safe amidst the pandemic. So all of those urban powwows were canceled. So I think it was so important that the university powwow that employs students to be able to work on it could pivot and do something for the community. Because I think, we haven't had powwow trail over the course of the summer. And I think people will be looking for excuses to celebrate and to get a glimpse of normalcy again. We still had to honor our grads. We still had to pay community members and feed people and take care of people, and we're thinking through ways of doing that through social distance methods.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think obviously, like, it's the challenge has been to, I think the pressure to just really quickly shift everything to an online format has been really, I think, unfair to a lot of educators, to a lot of people that deliver really good programming, and the expectation that you could just like really quickly put it online has been really challenging, I think, for a lot of people, especially when you kind of risk losing your funding to actually run these programs. And so I think that's one of the more obvious things that I've seen happening. But also too, like, I don't know, I'm still trying to think through what it means to engage in kind of a digital or online way of being in relation to Indigenous kind of knowledge systems. And I think for a lot of like queer folks, and like even myself when I was younger, like I had a hard time trying to find connection with my queer indigeneity. And the way I did that was actually through like building kinship relations with people like online. And I mean, like even right now, I don't think I would have ever been able to participate in a panel or a webinar like this, just because of how busy things can get. And when we're all in different kind of locations, it's always hard for us to gather. And I know there's been a lot of attempts to have a Two-Spirit or queer Indigenous kind of gathering of like young scholars, even at my own, at UBC, and it's been really difficult because a lot of us are just kind of in these different locations. We're in the same program, we have the same supervisor, but we've actually never met just because of how crazy and fast-paced everything is and the expectations that are put on us. And so I think right now, one of the like good things that that's happened is it's allowed a lot of us to be in conversation, albeit in very awkward ways. Like, it's so weird because I can't even hear myself because I also have noise canceling earphones. And so it's just, it's weird trying to have these kinds of conversations in this way, but it's also, I think, one pathway where we're able to kind of have a lot of these more serious conversations where you wouldn't, I think, necessarily be able to do that outside of a webinar context. You have to think about the cost of like hotels, travel, and a lot of us just can't afford to do that. And so I think that's one of the things. The other thing too, though, is I don't know. I think there's this assumption that a lot of people have just kind of, I don't know how I want to enter into this conversation. I'd say, like, in my own community, a lot of people haven't been listening to a lot of the health protocols to stay home. And it's complicated. And I find myself kind of in the middle because I obviously know the importance of not spreading this virus. But then when I was talking to some elders in my community, they said, well, those are ethical considerations for like our human relations, but we also have ethical relations and responsibilities to fulfill with our more than human kin, with our ceremonies. That just because there's a pandemic doesn't mean that we stop engaging in ceremony and we stop our relationship with the land, that we have to actually keep going. And so you have these like conflicting kind of conceptualizations of like health and wellness. And like, just, I think it was in May, there was the Birdies Sundance gathering in Saskatchewan that had a huge RCMP presence that tried to dismantle the ceremony. And that's what I've been seeing in my own community, is there's this heightened kind of police presence. And you also think about what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's almost like this the RCMP, the police are more emboldened. They're more in a fragile state because everyone's watching them. And in that state, there's been a lot more kind of blatant forms of violence that have been popping up. And so I think that's something that I've definitely seen kind of being impacted from COVID, is that it's not so much necessarily the virus that a lot of people are scared of. It's the heightened police presence and kind of using this pandemic as a way to justify keeping us off the land, to use it as a way to incarcerate us for practicing our ways, our land-based practices. And there's a lot of people talking about having to bring if we have to bring these practices back underground, like what happened during the Sundance and potlatch ban era. And so even in my own community, we're trying to figure out how do we do ceremony, how do we have Sundance, because we can't cancel our Sundance. It's never happened before. And so it's at least for me, I don't know how to navigate that, because there's two different kind of ethical systems or ethical considerations going on with not wanting to spread the virus, but then also too, like, there's certain kinds of ceremonial obligations that you can't just ignore. It's really kind of a messy thing to kind of try and think about what's the best way or appropriate way to go through this. And I don't know. And I've been in situations where somebody in our group tested positive for it. And so there's a lot of fear and stigma happening within our own community. There's a lot of lateral violence that's been going on. And so it's just a whole host of other challenges with trying to figure out how do we do this work in such complicated times. Yeah, and then the other thing I was thinking of is I have a lot of younger brothers and a niece who are on TikTok, and there's like this Indian TikTok thing that's like so amazing. That is, I don't know, it'd be interesting to look more into this, because it's almost like a platform of being politically aware and celebrating indigeneity without always having to be in a state of resistance or defending. That is just kind of celebrating the kind of playfulness or the that idea of what it means. Again, going back to what Max said originally, like what constitutes queer land-based learning and within an online context. And I don't know, I think like it's quite interesting to see TikTok used as a platform to kind of talk about these things, to engage in certain kinds of land-based practices, albeit not perfect, but given the circumstances, it's something that I've never like would have thought about being possible before. So yeah, that's just kind of something that I've been introduced to that I'm trying to think through. But yeah, that's just all I have to say.
Miigwech, Ryan, I was thinking when you were talking that it's the Indigenous queer community that has this body of knowledge spanning back centuries now of how to do ceremony differently and in a safe way. So I feel like in COVID, now that it's even more complicated, that's the body of knowledge that we can draw on. Those are the experts in figuring out how to meet our ethical obligations to our non-human relations while also staying safe. I want to thank everybody for your queer Indigenous brilliance and for taking the time to spend with us on Zoom. This was a really, really amazing conversation. So thanks to everybody, and I hope you have a really good evening. Go on, Min.